historical presentation. I'd like to start by reading the land acknowledgement. Chestermere Historical Foundation acknowledges that this presentation is being delivered on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations, and the home of the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. So in some of our past programs, we've touched on the role of the CPR's irrigation project in the development of the local area, from the early farming communities right through to the present day city of Chestermere. And we've heard about important figures like William Pierce, the so-called father of Alberta irrigation. But it's also important to research and document the lives of those people who actually worked on the ground here in our community for the CPR irrigation project. So today we'll be exploring the stories of 6 men known to have been employed by the CPR irrigation department as ditchriders in Chestermere. They came to the job with varying backgrounds and experiences. 2 of them were born in Scotland, 2 in England, 1 in the United States, and 1 in Canada. They served terms ranging from less than a year to nearly 14 years. In the future, we hope to present biographies of those who filled the position under the Western Irrigation District ownership from 1944 to the present. But this presentation will focus on those during the CPR era. So this map is from a 1912 map showing the entire western section of the CPR irrigation block, which in CPR days extended way out as far east as Gleason, as far north up near Crossfield. This is just a portion showing sort of Calgary to the Chestermere area. And it appears from this map that in 1912, the Chestermere head gates and the reservoir were not actually included in some of these subsections, but I know in later years, by the 20s certainly, that Chestermere was part of the Dalroy section. And on this map, the Dalroy section is here, this green line down here, up here, and then along the canal there. So what did these ditchriders do? Well, their primary duty was to deliver water to the farmers in a timely manner, and they were required to keep detailed records of these deliveries that they made. But that was only the tip of the iceberg in their job. We have a 1923 document entitled Instructions to Ditchriders, which outlines a plethora of tasks during the busy irrigation season, which ran from April 1st to October 31st. Work was to commence at 7 a.m. for a minimum 10-hour workday, but ditchriders were expected to work anytime, day or night, in the event of an emergency, such as a breach in the canal. The duties included recording daily water measurements and reporting them to the hydrographer at Strathmore head office, maintaining and repairing canal infrastructure and fences, removing weeds and vermin from the canal banks, and keeping a daily diary documenting crop conditions, interactions with water users, and canal breaks. In the off-season, the ditchrider was to continue with maintenance and repair work as long as weather permitted, and to spend the winter months preparing detailed crop reports for each farm unit in his district. In return, the company supplied a house and a barn at each of the headquarters, for which the ditchrider paid a monthly rent. In 1921, we know the rent at Chestermere was $10 a month for a 5-room house. The ditchrider had to supply 2 horses, a saddle, and a buckboard and harness for use in patrolling the ditches. In addition, he was required to maintain and extend the trees and shrubs at his building site and to raise hay, grain, and garden produce for his own use. Now, the catch here was that this work had to be done at his own expense and on his own time, but any excess of hay, grain, or garden produce couldn't be sold or given away. It had to be turned over to the company storehouse because it had been produced on company land. So not exactly a walk in the park, but of course, in this era, everybody on the land was working very hard, and the Ditchriders were no exception. So the first person that we know for sure that fulfilled the Chestermere Ditchrider position was Joseph Mackay, or perhaps Mackay Bannerman. He was born in Sutherland, Scotland in 1851, and he emigrated to Canada while still in his teens. Following a number of years in Ontario, he moved to Edmonton in 1882. The railway arrived in Calgary in 1883, and so did Joe Bannerman, making him one of the earliest settlers in the area. He married Christina Miller Sutherland in 1885, and they had a family of 6 children. Bannerman engaged in a number of businesses, including a tobacco store, wholesale liquor outlet, and he partnered with his brother James in a flour and feed enterprise. He homesteaded property that's now located under the southern portion of McCall Lake Golf Course up there off McKnight. He was very active in local social and political affairs. He was a Calgary alderman from January to October 1894, and was subsequently elected as the member of the Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly for the East Calgary Electoral District, and he served in that capacity until 1898. The East Calgary Electoral District at that time was not a city district. It was land stretching from the eastern boundary of Calgary all the way out to Gleason. So, and the Legislative Assembly sat in Regina. So he would have had to do a fair amount of traveling to fulfill his obligations as an MLA at that time. Joseph ranched during and after his terms as an elected official. And one item of note in our local historical knowledge is that his property was one of the ones searched by the mounted police in their hunt for the escaped murderer Ernest Cashel in January 1904. At the time, this Cashel case really gained a lot of press, not just in Calgary or Western Canada or even Canada. It was reported in the United States, in Britain, even in Australia. It was the sensational sort of story of its time. And as it turned out, Cashel was captured just 5 miles west of Chestermere on the Pittman Place, which is where Pembroke Meadows district or community is located now. So it's uncertain when Joe became the ditchrider at Chestermere, but it may have been after the death of his first wife, Christina, in 1907. The widowed Joseph was left to care for his children. 2 of them were still under 10 years of age, and was common in that era, maybe as a means of getting a babysitter. He married another woman, an English woman, Emma Northfield, in 1908, and he had 2 more children with her. Joe was certainly living at Chestermere in 1910, as referenced in this October 1910 newspaper item, this is just an excerpt from it that's on the screen. 2 hunters were out shooting ducks on the lake when their canoe capsized, and they nearly succumbed to drowning and hypothermia. Fortunately, a CPR employee rescued them and brought them to Joe's place, where dry clothing was secured and stimulants were applied, according to the article. And I'm imagining that stimulants were whiskey or brandy or something to warm them up and reinvigorate them. According to the 1911 census, Joe gave his occupation as Inspector, CP Irrigation Canal, which is certainly a much grander title than ditchrider. I know that the current term ditchrider was in current use for other people in that position because I've seen it on the census. So I don't know whether that was a self-invented title because a man of his previous experience didn't sound too noble to be a ditchrider, I guess. So whether he invented that or whether at that time the Chestermere person at Chestermere had a different title, I'm not sure. Now, we're fortunate to have some remembrances from a Bannerman neighbor, Kate Mackenzie. That's our own Kay Clark's grandmother. She recorded an amusing anecdote for posterity. And this was about her children, one of her daughters coming to her and showing her something. And this is what Kate wrote. Jean, her daughter, came with both hands closed. She opened her hand to show me a lanky grasshopper. I call this one Father, she said. And opening the other hand to show me a big fat cricket, she said, I call this one Mr. Bannerman. So I think we can gather from that that Joseph must have been a fairly large man, at least in comparison to Mr. Mackenzie. Joe resigned as ditchrider, and a brief news item in April 1912 reported that he and his family had left to spend the summer in Banff. They apparently enjoyed the mountain community as they moved there permanently. Second wife Emma died there in 1917, and Joe married for a third time Emma's sister Ruth in 1920. He remained active in political affairs and curling and so on in Banff until his death at the home of his daughter in Calgary on April 17th, 1932, and he's buried in Union Cemetery. The second person to fill the position was Frederick George Woods. He was born in Somerset, England in 1876. He was employed as an ironmonger's assistant from the time he was in his early teens while he lived in England. Perhaps seeking better opportunities, he came to Canada in 1906 and worked briefly as a carriage builder in Ontario before going to the US for a period of time. Fred's border crossing card provides us a description of his appearance. He was 5 foot, 1.5 inches tall, of ruddy complexion with brown hair and blue eyes. A return to Canada brought him to Alberta, where he found a job with a CPR irrigation survey crew. When his intended bride, Bessie Jane Hook, was to arrive in Calgary, he secured the position of ditchrider at Dalroy. Bessie, who was also a native of Somerset, had been a governess before leaving the UK in early 1910. She and Fred were married shortly after her arrival in Calgary. The contrast between the climate and surroundings of her native England and the new home on the Canadian prairies was something of a shock to Bessie. Decades later, her daughter wrote that in the summer of 1910, despite being hot and dry, the prairie was plagued by mosquitoes. Bessie missed the green of England and being surrounded by neighbors. She had to learn to bake bread, dress chickens, pump water, and numerous other chores required of country women. The first year, she boarded 10 men. Fred's earnings as a ditchrider in 1910 totaled $860 at Dalroy. The Woods' elder daughter, Margaret, was born in 1911 while they were stationed at Dalroy. After 2 years there, the Woods family moved to the Chestermere headquarters, and they actually lived with the outgoing ditchrider Joseph Bannerman and his family for a month before the Bannermans left for Banff. So thanks to Kay Clark's mother, Agnes Mackenzie Lester, we have an account of the only child documented to have been born at a Chestermere ditchrider property. And this is what she wrote. On 14 February 1915, mother went up to see our new neighbor, the Woods, the ditchrider and family to the north. We knew that Mrs. Woods was expecting, and when she got there, the baby girl had already arrived early that very day. Mr. Woods had the only telephone in the country and had got a nurse out of Calgary. Mother helped him get the bread that Mrs. Woods had started that morning into the pans before she came back with the exciting news. So a side note is here that one of the things that the CPR irrigation system did was they had a private telephone service that connected head office in Strathmore to the various headquarter points in the western section. And as such, they were usually the only people to have a phone in the very early days. Later on, the system was amalgamated with the government telephone system. And now, apparently, grain and cattle prices were good in 1918. So when the opportunity arose to purchase the Chestermere headquarters, Fred decided to retire from ditch riding and become a farmer. He seeded his first crop in 1919 and experienced the ups and downs of agriculture through hail, droughts, bumper crops, and the depression in the ensuing years. Fred had a passion for mechanical things and spent his spare time keeping the gasoline pump engine and his Model T Ford in good running condition with help from his neighbors. Fred was the only Chestermere ditch rider that remained in the community after his term of employment with CPR. He died in hospital on September 3rd, 1943, following a brief illness, and was buried in Burnsland. His wife, Bessie, rented the farmland to neighbor Pete Lester, that's Kay Clark's father, sold the livestock, machinery, and household effects at an auction sale in November 1943 and moved to Calgary. The Woods' daughter, also Bessie, recorded in the family history in Saddle Sleighs and Sad Irons that the farmhouse was rented to a succession of tenants, then stood vacant, was stripped by vandals, and then burnt by a firebug. So that was the end of the first CPR ditch rider house. The third person to be a ditch rider at Chestermere was a man named Edward Staves. He was born in Lincolnshire, England in 1878. He held various jobs, including a railway engine cleaner and a stoker at a print works. In 1904, he married Margaret Ellen Boothman, with whom he had 2 children. Leaving his family in England, Ted arrived in Strathmore in 1914 and found work as the lineman in charge of CPR's Western Section telephone system. There you can see a photograph from the Glenbow of a telephone crew near Chestermere in 1913. So we've got the cookhouse, I would say, and then the tents for the men to sleep in while they were working on the line. In October 1915, 19 months after setting foot on Canadian soil, Ted enlisted at Calgary as a private in the Canadian Expeditionary Force. His attestation paper described him as standing 5 feet, 8.5 inches tall, with black hair, blue eyes, and a fair complexion. Following a period of training in Canada, Ted was shipped over to England in May 1916 and on to France in August of that year. Early in 1917, he was trained as a non-commissioned officer and received promotion to the rank of corporal in March. And the 50th Battalion, which was an Alberta infantry unit, took part in the now immortalized Battle of Vimy Ridge from April 9th to 12th, the anniversary of which we have just recently passed. And they suffered heavy casualties. Ted was amongst the wounded, having received a gunshot wound to the face on April 12th, which severely fractured his lower jaw. He was evacuated to a field hospital and then back to England for surgery. Ted was promoted to sergeant on May 10th and was subsequently awarded the Military Medal for bravery in the field. There's a picture of the military medal of that era in the upper right corner of the screen. And the citation, the medal citation reads, "In the attack on the Pimple, Vimy Ridge, April 12th, 1917, he showed great bravery and devotion to duty during the attack. Although he was seriously wounded in the face during the advance, he persisted to the final objective and would have remained there had he not been ordered back. His report to headquarters on the way to the dressing station was clear and accurate and of great value in reinforcing the line. No doubt his action was partially responsible for successfully repelling the counterattack, which developed soon afterwards on this part of the line." So following a second operation in October 1917 and the fitting of dentures, Ted was declared medically unfit for duty and invalided back to Canada in February 1918. He was finally discharged from the service on June 26th. Likely in late 1918, Ted secured employment with the CPR as the Chestermere ditch rider, and his family joined him in early 1919. So as we learned, the original Chestermere headquarters property had recently been purchased by the previous ditch rider, Fred Woods. So the Staves family moved into a newly constructed company house located further south. And there's a photograph of it, again from the Glenbow, right when it was just being finished in the end of 1918. Again, we have some commentary from their neighbor, Kate Mackenzie. She recalled that, quote, "The CPR built a new house nearer to the head gates for Mr. Staves, who took over. He was a returned man. He did hard work breaking the land around the new house almost by hand and planted trees. This was to be a demonstration of what irrigation could do. In May 1922, Ted spotted the body of a drowning victim who had disappeared the previous October. He had been tasked with watching the lake after extensive efforts the previous autumn had failed to find the man when he went missing. Ted served as the Chestermere Ditchrider for nearly 14 years until his tragic death at age 55 in 1933. On the morning of August 9th, he borrowed his son's rifle, presumably to shoot a muskrat that was causing damage to the canal bank. When he failed to return to make his morning report to the Dalroy watermaster, his son went to find him and discovered his father near the fence about 200 yards from the house with a gunshot wound to his head. He died in hospital in Calgary that afternoon. The subsequent coroner's jury found that the fatal injury had likely occurred when the gun's trigger caught on the barbed wire and discharged as Ted crawled through the fence. As a veteran, Ted was buried in Burnsland Cemetery's Field of Honor. The next man is our first Canadian-born person to hold the position. John Smith Mackay was born in St. John, New Brunswick in 1873. He found work with a railway company in his youth and was a clerk at the time of his marriage to Alice Elizabeth Walls in 1900. Soon after the wedding, the couple moved to Calgary, where the first of their 7 children was born. And John was employed by the CPR-owned Dominion Express Company, first in Calgary and then in Fort Macleod. He left this company in late 1911 or early 1912 and served as Macleod's postmaster from late January 1912 until early June 1913. In mid-June, the local newspaper reported that J.S. Mackay, late postmaster here, left on Monday for the Pacific Coast. He will visit a number of places on Vancouver Island with a view to locating there. A suitable situation must not have been found, as the paper noted in early August that John had moved back to Calgary to work again for the Dominion Express Company. But in 1914, the Mackays decided to go farming and took up land 2.5 miles north of Strathmore. Unfortunately, the first crop was completely destroyed by hail, and that put an end to farming. It appears that John may also have engaged in an auction business, as the Strathmore newspaper carried numerous advertisements for sales conducted by a John S. Mackay throughout 1915 and early 1916. By the time irrigation season rolled around in 1916, John had obtained employment as a ditchrider with the CP Irrigation District at the Cheadle headquarters, and he would likely have continued there until his retirement, but for the untimely death of Ed Staves in 1933. Given the drought conditions in the 30s, the vacancy at Chestermere needed to be filled by an experienced man, so the Mackays were transferred to Chestermere on March 1st, 1934. And before their departure, the community surprised them with a farewell party consisting of musical and dramatic entertainment, lunch, and a presentation of gifts. And a newspaper item in the Strathmore Standard concluded the report of this event with a little bit of doggerel verse. And it said, oh my, we hate to see them go. Oh my, for we will miss them so. It will be with kindest memories we think of them so dear while they are bathing in Chestermere. John retired after the completion of the 1937 irrigation season and subsequently went to live in Calgary. But in 1934, the Mackays moved back to Strathmore as John had been appointed an assistant in guarding war prisoners there. He died in Strathmore on December 18th, 1952, and was laid to rest in Queen's Park Cemetery. Next, we have James Henry May. He was born March 22nd, 1886 in Butte, Montana. His parents were natives of Cornwall, England, and had immigrated to the United States in 1885, shortly after their marriage. The May family returned to Cornwall for several years, but by June 1900, they had returned to Butte. James was employed there as an office boy, and his father was working as a copper miner. As people probably know, Cornwall is famous for its tin and copper mines, and in that era, there'd be many men there that were miners and that could find work in North America. Later that same year, they moved again, this time to Rossland, BC, where the 1901 census listed James as a teamster and his father as a gold miner. The family came to Alberta about 1904, settled west of Didsbury, and took up farming. In June 1905, James obtained entry to a homestead located in the Big Prairie District, about 4.5 miles northwest of Cremona. He received title to the property in January 1909. James married Beatrice Hogg, the daughter of a career British military man, in July 1910. In addition to farming, James was active in local affairs, serving as secretary of the local school board for a number of years, and was a member of the Didsbury Masonic Lodge. In 1922, the Mays gave up farming and moved to Calgary, where James secured a job as foreman of a CPR irrigation crew. This led to him becoming a ditch rider, and the family relocated to the Irrigation headquarters, about 5 miles northwest of town. The published local history for that area mentioned that James patrolled the ditches with a horse and cart circa 1925. He involved himself in community organizations, again serving as a school board secretary. He was also a member of the Irrigation Masonic Lodge and served as its master in 1930. The Mays were transferred to the Hervey headquarters northwest of Strathmore in 1934 to fill the vacancy left when John McKay was moved to Chestermere. And while in the area, James was a member of the Strathmore Masonic Lodge. After a 4-year tenure at Hervey, James again followed in McKay's footsteps as he was sent to Chestermere in the spring of 1938. And we have a documented birth at Chestermere headquarters, and now we also have a documented wedding reception at Chestermere headquarters. When the Mays' younger daughter Alice was married in the summer of 1938, the wedding ceremony took place in Strathmore, but the reception for 50 guests was held at the May residence in Chestermere. And the fact that the house was fairly small, it's likely that the lovely garden would have been utilized for this celebration as well. A little more than 3 months after this joyful occasion, James May died in Calgary on October 27th, 1938. He had been experiencing poor health periodically over the previous several months and was taken to hospital less than a week before his death. After his death, he was buried in Burnsland Cemetery. So James Henry May was the person who held the shortest term in the CPR era as ditch rider at Chestermere. We began with a Scot and we end with a Scot in the CPR Chestermere Ditch Riders. Edward Ross was born into a large Aberdeenshire farming family in 1886. He married Elizabeth Betty Collison Clark in 1909, and 10 days after the wedding, he departed for Manitoba. Betty and their infant daughter followed in 1910. Ed was employed as a motorman on the Winnipeg Street Railway until late 1917 or early 1918. The Rosses moved to Alberta, and by 1921, Ed was a farm manager near Wardlow, earning $1,500 per year. Ed and family relocated to the Rockyford area, where they lived until early 1925, before moving to the Winona CPR irrigation headquarters that was located about 4 miles west and a mile south of Rockyford. The Rosses were active in community life. Ed was a Mason. He was a first principal of the Strathmore chapter and was affiliated with the local United Church. His wife Betty was involved in the Baintree Community Club and the Baintree Local of the United Farm Women of Alberta, the Order of the Eastern Star, and the Rockyford United Church's Ladies Aid Society. Ed and Betty's only child, Edna, married Bill Sullivan, who was the son of a Chestermere area pioneer, Jerry Sullivan. It must have been difficult for Ed and Betty to leave the area where they had put down such deep roots, but they received a warm send-off from their neighbors before moving to Chestermere on March 30th, 1939. One interesting thing I found was that in the summer of 1941, a Strathmore news item reported that there was a man named young man named Ray Gordon employed as assistant ditchrider at Chestermere. And to date, this is the only known mention of Chestermere having an assistant ditchrider that I've been able to find. In July 1943, the Strathmore paper noted that Mr. and Mrs. Ed Ross of Chestermere have very kindly established a signal system with the Cadet Corps, which was the Sea Cadets, by which important telephone messages may be transmitted from their home to cadets in the Chestermere Lake camp. This is a kindly service which is greatly appreciated. In 1942, the CPR had announced that it would abandon the western section and began to fill in old ditches and remove unused structures. This caused alarm amongst area water users. And after lengthy and tenuous negotiations, the two parties reached agreement in March 1944 to transfer the system to the farmer-controlled Western Irrigation District. By the time this upheaval was taking place, Ed was nearing 60 years of age. Rather than transfer to the new WID operation, he opted to remain with CPR and finished his career with them as an accounting clerk in the Department of Natural Resources, retiring about late 1952 or early 1953. Ed died June 8th, 1956, and is buried in Queen's Park. And there's an interesting tie-in to Ed Ross in later years. The two photographs here of Ed and Betty Ross were donated by his grandson-in-law, a man named Robert Walker. Robert Walker, also donated a rowing trophy that his grandfather, George Walker, had won in 3 consecutive years, 29, 30, and 31. And they donated, the yacht club gave him the trophy because he'd won it 3 consecutive years. The races that were put on Chestermere in that era by the Calgary Yacht Club, which still exists in Chestermere, they were a feature of the area. And a further tie-in was Robert Walker's daughter, Christine, married Tom Heggie, whose parents had a cabin at Chestermere, I think in the 60s. And Jennifer featured them in one of her presentations about cabin owners. So I think one of the things that's important to remember is, although we've learned some things about the role of the CPR in its importance to the local community, right from early ranchers and farmers down to present day Chestermere. And we've heard about people like William Pierce, who were, he's called the father of Alberta irrigation. We just thought it was important to also document the lives of the people that actually worked here on the ground in our community, and to record those for posterity. So the first half of the project is the CPR era, and the second half, still to be completed, is those that worked under the Western Irrigation District. And we hope to have something on that maybe within the next year. COVID has made some things very difficult. So I guess I would just like to close by acknowledging people that assisted with this, which was Kay Clark for material from her family archive, Christine Heggie, Jennifer Pedalston, Robert Walker, and also I did quite a lot of extensive research at the Glenbow Western Research Center at the University of Calgary. The last thing would be, please visit the website, members and visitors, because there's a lot of information there, not just about Ditchriders, more detail about the Ditchriders, but a lot of other information on Chestermere history, and some of the past programs are posted on there. And also, if you're a person on social media, we've got a presence on Facebook and on Twitter, and you can follow us there. So I think now I would just take questions if there is any, and that's it.
Well done. That was great.
Thank you, Eileen. That was wonderful. And I really appreciate all the detail that you went into. You can tell Eileen's a very good researcher. So
I have a question.
Any questions? Yeah.
Was Robert Walker the Bob Walker that lived on the lake for so many years?
Jennifer, you know more about the cabin people. Did Bob Walker live at the lake or not?
No, he
Mhm.
didn't live at the lake. He lived in Calgary. And right now he
Okay.
lives in Saskatchewan, and I think he's well on in his 90s. And but he brought out to us in 2012 this trophy that his great grandfather had won in the 30s. So no,
Wow.
he's not. He didn't live at the lake, but his daughter Christine was married to Tom Heggie, and you would remember them, Dave. Barney and Jane Heggie, who lived on the west side.
Yeah.
Yeah. So their daughter Christine married Robert Walker's daughter, and his great grandfather
Okay.
was the one who
Cool.
won all the
Very
trophies
interesting.
out here. So, yeah, but not that Robert Walker, I don't believe. So,
Okay.
oh, hello there, Lorraine. And Heather
I
Diggins.
think I got a
there.
picture.
Great.
I've got a picture of the trophy here somewhere.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, Eileen, that was a very good presentation.
Thank you, Dave.
Yes, thank you.
Does anybody have any questions?
I have an unrelated one, Eileen. Are you any relation to Tim McElroy?
To Tim?
Yeah.
I do have a cousin named Tim. There's a few
Well,
of us
I
in
used
the spread out in the country.
Well, he told me at one point he had ties to Chestermere. I was on the organizing committee of the Olympics, and he worked as a staff member for the Olympics.
Yeah, and he had a
Does that ring
bus
a bell?
company. He had a bus company.
Yes.
Same, yes. Actually,
Yeah,
I
there you go.
recently, well, last year during COVID, reunited with Tim after many, many years of not seeing him at a family funeral, sadly. But we've exchanged quite a bit of information. His grandfather and my grandfather were brothers.
Okay. He was a very nice guy.
Yeah, great guy.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you.
Did you find that picture of the trophy yet?
Oh, sorry. Let me just look. Okay.
I just wanted to welcome Heather because her relatives had cottage here. And I worked with her dad. I don't know whether she's still online there or not. Anyway, old cabin owners.
I'm trying to
I don't
remember
know
where
if you
I
know
found
this,
it.
Jennifer, but my great uncle, my father's great uncle with Pallison, Mayor Pallison.
Right.
Yeah.
Can you, oh, I don't know. Can you screen share something off my screen? That's not in the presentation.
I think you can share it because I think I gave you permission.
Can you see that though?
No.
See, I can share my Zoom presentation, but I don't know how to just share my screen.
Well, we do have lots of pictures of the trophy on the website. So.
Oh, it's on the website. Another reason for people to please go for the website, because Jen has posted a lot of material there. And it's fun to just kind of poke around and see what you can see there.
Right. Good. Well, Eileen is planning to make this all into a book sometime. So once we get all the rest of the Ditchrider stories from the more modern times, she's going to work on that. She's promised, but I mean, this is all in the future. And we hope that maybe next month we might have a panel discussion with a present day Ditchrider and maybe some other Ditchriders who've worked here in more recent times. And that may be for our May meeting, but we're not sure. It all depends. But so you can stay tuned. Good.
Yes, and when we say a book, what we mean is all the stories gathered together in a binder.
Yeah.
We're not publishing a book. We're just wanting to document these things and make sure that it's part of the archives of the Chestermere Historical Foundation.
Right. Good. great. So anyone who isn't a member, we encourage you to go online and become a member. We have a new 3-year option that is available. We thought that was better than trying to bother everybody every year, and it's still a great deal at $5 a year. And we appreciate having those numbers and having everyone participate when they can and spread the word about our programs. Jackie Kleiner is here on screen, and she is one of the organizers for Historic Calgary Week, which is July 25th to August something. It's a week. And there are many, many programs going to be on. There might be some in person by that time, but virtual is being planned. So a whole week of history from Strathmore down to Okotoks and out towards Cochrane. I'm sure it will be I know there are about 60 or 70 groups that were willing to make presentations. So keep tabs on that. And we'll also be doing programs on Chestermere's Seniors Week on June 7th. So lots of options for historical knowledge. So great. Okay, well, thank you, everyone.
Oh, you